You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
I think there's the problem with the money changers
Uh-huh.
that we don't really talk about in the Bible. Like the temple got to the point where commerce and trade almost to an illicit level was taking place within um, what was supposed to be a house of God. So when Christ goes in with the whip and like clears out all the money changers, it's it's very much in the face of what modern Christianity has become in many ways. Because, we're talking about, drug possession, prostitution, trespassing, and all these things that are not crimes that more, symptoms of poverty and bad economic factors. One of the things that conservatives really don't want, and I think some of these evangelical Christians don't want, because a lot of these evangelical Christians are being caught with drugs and being caught in sex scandals. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the rich and the powerful and the people who can influence culture do actually want a black market for themselves that they can have access to. That normal people like you and I, that are middle class or lower, or working class, can do not have access to, because it is both a question of privilege and a question of power. Um, Being able to access these things that are considered dark and illicit is very much a behavior of the rich and the wealthy and the powerful. So, like, they don't want us to take part in that because it puts us on equal grounds with them.
Right.
But
But
at the
isn't it
same
interesting?
time, like, if they can no longer police these people while at the same time taking part in their marketplace, these
Right.
people that they were trying to police are going to build their own marketplace, and they're going to find themselves suddenly on equal with these rich and the powerful, because there's
Isn't it
there's real
interesting?
money in sex and drugs.
Isn't it really interesting how it seems like the only time Jesus got pissed off is when he went to the temple.
Yeah, I think Jesus really does say a lot about the wealthy not being able to make it into heaven as easily as those who are generous or those who are suffering. And I think there is a clear reason why, when he says, Jesus has many mixed messages
Mm-hmm.
um, that all kind of coincide if you really think about them and take the time to put them together. Because on one hand, he says, give unto others what you can give, that you would give unto yourself. And if you have two coats and you are able to give one of those coats to someone who does not have one, give that coat to that other person, so they may be warm as you are. Same thing with, like, teach a man to fish, blah blah blah. um at the same time, Jesus will say things like, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. um because I think Jesus has, and I'm now getting into the economics of what Christ's economy would look like if he was running things.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this is kind of not talking about too short a season, but we'll get there. Um, I don't think Christ is necessarily against the idea of a marketplace. I don't. I just think that you have to put it in the context of him being a Jewish rabbi and there being a clear separation of behavior in the temple
Mm-hmm.
versus common behavior outside of it.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, when he says, coming from the viewpoint of a Jewish rabbi, when he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, there are Jews contemporary to his time as a rabbi who are paying taxes to Caesar
Mm-hmm.
and who are actually paying religious homage to Caesar every year as required by the state. You
Mhm.
know, it's kind of like saying the Pledge of Allegiance in a way here in America, which has its own connotations that we could get into in terms of other episodes, because I think
Mhm.
there's one that kind of addresses it. Um, but Christ doesn't have necessarily a problem with governments or marketplaces. He does have a problem with it inside God's house in terms of the actual behavior that takes place. That house is meant for the observance of ritual and the
Mhm.
observance of faith and the enrichment of those two things
Mhm.
and ceremony. And commerce and economics are not necessarily meant for ritual and ceremony. They're very much mercantile things that
Mhm.
have no value in,
Mhm.
in those areas, except maybe providing ancillary things to enable those events to take place. Like you're going to have to buy the bread from someplace to have the Eucharist. You're going to have to buy the wine from someplace.
Mhm.
They have to
Sure.
get their robes somewhere.
Right.
But I think Christ is very much a. It's going to sound weird, but like people make the mistake of reading Leviticus as kind of this book about um, how you need to live your everyday life as a Christian, and they misunderstand that that is a Jewish text about how people are allowed and supposed to how people are supposed to actually take part in rituals and ceremonies in the Jewish temple and the things that would actually disallow them from getting into the temple. Because I think we're not putting into proper context how important going to the temple and receiving your rituals and ceremonies, or for Christians their sacraments, are
Mhm.
at this time contemporaneous to Christ. Like being able to go to the temple is a very important thing if you're a Jew. Even to this day, if
Mhm.
you're a real practicing faithful Orthodox Jew, going to the temple is a daily important part of your existence. It's not just oh, we go every Sunday to see the neighbors and hear and see the priest and
Mhm.
go to Sunday school. Like this is an integral part of your life that you think about.
Mhm.
Um, Doing business in the temple is probably not fitting with Leviticus, and Christ knew that, and going in there and clearing them out with a whip is the least he could have done. Because Leviticus, from a from any standpoint, is a very severe book.
Mhm.
But Christ, we also have to recognize that Christ said that he was not there to overwrite the law, but there to see the fulfillment of it.
Mhm.
So if we're going to see the fulfillment of the law, we also have to some ways see the fulfillment of Leviticus.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
if we're going to see the fulfillment of Leviticus from a biblical standpoint, the proper way to frame it, and I think this is where evangelicals and a lot of modern Christians fail, um, it really is a liturgical text about how to get into the temple and take part in the ceremonies. It's not actually applicable to like everyday life. For example, um, tattooing.
Mhm.
Tattooing is something that would like not get you in the temple. Homosexuality would not get you in the temple. Wearing clothes of two different um, fibers would not get you in
Mhm.
the temple.
Mhm.
These things are kind of impossible. Now, the thing that I think a lot of Christians miss out is that there's another part of ancient Jewish tradition that um, involved absolution, which was basically bathing yourself away of your sins. And they used to actually have these huge troughs in ancient Judea in all the towns and in all the synagogues where you'd actually like walk through a bath, and that would absolve you of your sins for whatever you had done. Now, this included things like, women weren't allowed to go into the temple while they were on their period during their menstrual cycle. They had to actually, this is where the entire, like, they have to leave and go wash by the river and all that bullshit starts. Like, they have to do that so they can be cleansed long enough before they can re enter the temple and absolve themselves in this pool. So there's a lot of things about Leviticus that are misinterpreted because a lot of the ritual and ceremony around Leviticus has been intentionally forgotten.
Well, we can cover this in more detail when we do our Old Testament podcast series.
Yeah, definitely. So let's get started with Too Short a Season.
Sure.
So, um, everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, starring myself, Jay Record, and my father, Jake Record, as we explore Star Trek The Next Generation in turn from its characters, themes, and episodes, starting from season 1 all the way to season 7. We know there's a lot of fans out there besides Ben the Bear, who this podcast is being made for, so we're putting this for free up on YouTube. So today we're exploring Too Short a Seasons, season 1, episode 15, or episode 16, by the official count. There's a difference because of the Netflix coding, and
Mhm.
sometimes the Amazon coding too. But this episode debuted on February 8th, 1988. But before we get into that, Dad, I was wondering if you wanted to review any of your thoughts that you had made to me after the recording of our previous episode, 11001101.
Well, the one thought I had after the last podcast is that since it was so focused on the holodeck, is that if the idea is that it could one recreate a dream on the holodeck and then live it,
Mm-hmm.
and the specific uh, situation would be if you have dreams. I think people dream all the time, but they don't remember the dreams all the time. So when you have a dream that's sort of a waking dream that you wake up and you remember the dream, and if you hang on to it, um, could someone then program the holodeck um, so they could actually then try to live out that dream?
Mm-hmm.
And that brings up the question of, well, how do you specifically, in the Star Trek universe, how did they um, program the holodeck for um, specific scenarios and stories and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Like when Picard becomes Dixon Hill, he refers to the Pulp Fiction novels that can go, the holodeck can go into the computer database, and they have enough information apparently that they can create, San Francisco in 1940 and so
Mm-hmm.
on. But how would someone take information about a dream and present that or enter it into the holodeck to do it? And then would it be possible to do it, to live in that dream, to try that dream out? Excuse me. And what would be the consequences of it? Would it be a good thing or a bad thing?
So there are so many great questions packed in there. As far as being able to reconstruct a dream in the holodeck, they do it in a future episode. I think around season, it'll either be season 5 or season 6, but it's the episode where Riker and various members of the crew are unable to sleep, and it turns out they're being kidnapped by an alien race that lives in subspace. And they're being kidnapped every night through basically this subspace portal that drags the crew members through, and they're experimented on the other side. But during that episode, it's Riker, Geordi, and I think 2 crewmen and Troy in the holodeck, and they basically recreate the table that they've all dreamt up they've been on, and they've basically used the holodeck to rebuild the table, and therefore reconstruct the dream in their head, and they reconstruct the room that they've all imagined when they've failed to find sleep.
Hmm.
So the
Mhm.
possibility of actually reconstructing a dream on the holodeck is completely possible. Um, the question of how they would go about that, you bring up a really interesting question because it gets into the topic of how far is our perception, how far are we able to, I guess, mimic perception in a real world way? Like, You and I see with our natural organic eyes, or we don't. Some people are born blind, but we see and feel with our five senses, and we have as many as 25 senses going all at once, including spatial senses. Uh, Being able to perceive this reality with our natural senses is such a complicated thing because our brain is taking in so much information and basically reporting it back to us in this exploding collage of images, sights, sounds, smells, all these sorts of things. Being able to capture that on a holodeck has to be such a monumental task of programming and coding and being able to we already know that they have replicators that can recombine proteins and also I guess recombine materials because they can replicate parts. But the holodeck itself has to be a real monumental achievement of psychology and perception, and also being able to map the brain in some way because you have to be able to engage the brain in a way that when it sees something in front of it in the holodeck, it doesn't automatically go it's a hologram. It knows it's a hologram, but the trick is being able to have someone look at the hologram and still go, suspend their disbelief entirely. Which we see later on when in season two when Dr. Pulaski goes with Data and Geordi to Victorian London for the first real Data Sherlock Holmes episode.
Hmm. Hmm.
And she even notes there like how amazing it is that the holodeck is able to recreate the kind of atmosphere of Victorian
Hmm.
London.
Hmm.
Um, is the amazement in the fact that it is so lifelike and real that it's almost akin to what life is like outside the holodeck. Um, getting to the question of just like how is that built and how is it perceived, and then what is the effect of that. Um, we know with like Lieutenant Reg Barclay, like you can have holodeck addiction.
Hmm.
And I guess this gets into the question that you asked, like, if you could reconstruct the dream, could you live in the dream?
Well, the other thing this does is gets into actually into the too short a season
Mm-hmm.
when, you know, one of the things is that Mark Jameson, takes this drug and you can, you know, set the story up a little bit better after I make this comment is that he takes a drug which is sort of a fountain of youth drug.
Mm-hmm.
So he regains his youth. Um, he ends, he by taking this drug, he ends a um, severe disabling disease that he has. And that gets back into the idea of if you could go back, if you're 68 years old and then you
Mm-hmm.
could somehow go back to your 24 and you had youthful vitality and so on. And at the same time, you had the ability to kind of relive your life and get to a crossroads. As you know, the joke that Yogi Berra made is when you get to a fork in the road, take it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that if you had that opportunity and you knew that in your past life you went to the left, but this time says, now I have an opportunity to go a different direction. I'm going to go to the right. If that's sort of like a dream scenario in a sense, or a different scenario for your life, is that something you could do in the holodeck also? It's kind of similar to a dream.
Well, so we'll get to Too Short a Season right after this. Because you're right, there is a real element of fantasy that Mark Jameson kind of employs here. Um, but as it comes to the holodeck, I think what you're describing a little bit is why people play video games.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for example, I'm writing a blog post right now for my new website, which will hopefully be done sooner than later. But I'm looking at the my favorite action fantasy games, and my favorite game is Skyrim,
Mm-hmm.
and because it mimics the aesthetic of traditional or classic fantasy, which is to me like swords, spells, dragons, wizards, all that stuff, elves,
Hmm.
Tolkien, basically
Hmm.
fleshed.
Hmm.
Um, I think that there is a part of me that, as a child, always wanted to live in worlds like that. And I think video games like Skyrim give you the ability to enjoy that fantasy. So I think if you had something like the holodeck, it would be even more alluring than I think what a video game is. Because I think there's some real value in video games in terms of being able to go in there and enact those fantasies.
Hmm.
Um, because I think we all need some sort of play. And I think technology has given us an ability to play that is both positive and in many, many ways, but also detrimental in others.
Well, that's an interesting comparison you made of that. Video games, in a sense, are an antecedent technology to the holodeck,
Mm-hmm.
if such a technology would be possible. And we've talked about this before about the 3D devices where you put onto your over your
Oh yeah,
face,
virtual
that
reality.
the virtual reality devices that really, on a previous podcast I talked about my experience with that, where it was very real, very disorienting in terms of the spatial perception of it. And that to me is a sense that it's not the holodeck, but by putting on the virtual reality goggles, in essence, puts you in that type of holodeck type space.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the things that we're going to be dealing with going forward, because and we spoke about this previously, I don't think necessarily that virtual reality is going to be the antecedent to the holodeck as much as augmented reality is. And I think that is here now, and we've seen the beginning success of it with games like.
Can you hold mom's
Yeah,
calling?
no problem. um okay, so sorry, we had to talk to mom for a second. um so I think with augmented reality, especially with some of its early successes with like the game Pokemon Go, which was a gigantic success that um, has kind of faded to the side, but was very underappreciated for what it achieved. I think that we're going to start. I think augmented reality is more of the antecedent for the holodeck, because it will be something that we interact with directly,
Mm.
which I think the problem with VR is that you still have kind of the limitation.
Oh yeah, I understand what you're saying. Just to use virtual reality, augmented reality. I don't know whether virtual reality would be on the same continuum, but yeah, I mean, we've made some advances with you know video games, and you've got virtual reality, and whether it's on the same path or it's on a different course. Yeah, from what you're describing as augmented reality would be the next step towards some type of holodeck like tech uh, uh, technology
Well, I
involving holograms.
I really do think that the future, with Elon Musk experimenting with Neuralink technology, which is
Mm-hmm.
basically weaving in a interface into your actual brain that you can, from what I understand, you're going to actually have an access. You're going to be able to access like a heads up display with your eye. Um, but the idea from that has already been talked about, that like you'll be able to simulate video games in your brain. So the holodeck will be in your head. So maybe the future is actually not necessarily a physical room that you go to, but an actual program that you run in your head,
Mm-hmm.
which, in some ways the room may have a lot more benefits than we talk about the worry that we have about the media's effect on us and its ability to coerce and conceive and be able to convince people of ideas that maybe may or may not be true.
Hmm.
If this, imagine you had a Neuralink technology and everyone had access to these programs that they walked into every night, like they sat down and they were whisked away to another world. Imagine there was an arbiter of who was running those programs,
Hmm.
and they were just able to insert any sort of information they wanted to,
Hmm.
or take any sort of information they wanted to. We've
Hmm.
spoken previously that the holodeck is also a place where people would be able to experiment with some of the more darker human aspects.
Hmm.
Imagine the kind of information you can get. And you've mentioned this previously when it came to like genetic information, people giving away their genetics through 23andMe and Ancestry.com.
Hmm.
You know, what kind of access do these technologies give us, but what do they also take away from us? Um, I think that is an important question when it comes to the the question of what do we actually do with a holodeck when it comes to like building out our dreams or exploring our
Hmm.
fantasies or
Hmm.
even just like the long-term health implications or mental health implications of exposure to the real that is unreal,
Hmm.
you know because Star Trek also puts forward the idea that at some point these holograms are not artificial people, they are actual people
Hmm.
in the most essential substance. They
Hmm.
have actual sentience, like the doctor from Voyager, or the emergency medical hologram, the EMH,
Right.
develops sentience to the point where he's recognized as an actual organism or being. God bless you.
Thank you.
um but he's actually recognized as an organism or being. So
Hmm.
there's some very difficult questions of what is real and what isn't, but Star Trek tries to at least apply the question of, well, okay, let's not deal with what is real and what isn't. How do we treat what is there?
Hmm.
And I think what Star Trek hopes that we do ultimately, if we have to deal with these sort of technologies and the results that they may produce, is that we treat them with the same human dignity that they've developed in terms of treating each other,
Hmm.
which is, I think going to be hard. Um, Especially if we look at some of the more human failings, like in this episode, Too Short a Season. Um, you brought up kind of the fantasy of how to the fountain of youth idea, and
Why don't you go ahead and set up the story, what the
uh,
storyline
of
is?
course, so
Yeah.
the crew of the Enterprise D has been sent to Persephone 5 to pick up Admiral Mark Jameson, not Jacobson. God damn it, Mark Jameson and his wife Annie from Persephone 5. So Mark Jameson is famous for brokering a sort of diplomatic deal with the current administrator of a planet Mordan 4, a man by the name of Karnas. In a previous episode of Jameson's life, he had he and Karnas helped broker some sort of power sharing trade on the behalf of the Federation, and this led to Mark Jameson ascending to an admiralship within the Federation. One important thing that is to be noted is that when they arrive at Persephone 5, Mark Jameson is very, very old. He is wheelchair bound. He is suffering from a neurodegenerative disease that Beverly will later reveal to be called Iverson's disease, which is irreversible, which makes this drug that Dad mentioned earlier that reverses the aging process even more complicated. Uh, and on top of that, they are being tasked to go to Mordan 4 because Karnas, the leader of that planet, is unable to free some Federation hostages that have supposedly been taken captive by some terrorists. So, updating that to where we are. Uh, you know, one question I had about the Fountain of Youth idea. Starting out, you know, Mark Jameson, through his diplomatic channels, is able to get access to this drug from this planet called Cerebus 2. And essentially, what it does is basically reverse your body's aging. It seems. I guess the idea is that it's supposed to take you from old age back to some sort of stable youth, maybe your 20s or 30s, and you're supposed to live out your life again.
Right. In theory. Yeah.
In theory. Uh, there is a remark made that the research was, I guess, considered abandoned or unethical at some point. Picard said, "Oh yeah, so he obtained a drug for Cerebus 2 that rejuvenates the body, and he negotiated a treaty there for the inhabitants, but it is a combination of drugs to be administered slowly over 2 years." That's the part that I missed.
Mm-hmm.
And he was originally going to administer this to himself and his wife before this mission came up. And he decided to take both doses quickly in hope of quickening the process before he meets Karnas. So the question I'm trying to get at after stumbling through that description, um, so Dad, would you take? So the easy question to open with the Fountain of Youth conversation: if you had access to a drug that could send you back to your 20s and 30s, would you take it?
Um, if it was clinically proven, uh, the answer would be yes.
Yeah.
And there are drugs on the market now that um, like you see in television ads like Prevagen. Think of that, which is some sort of you know uh, you know compound. I think it comes from jellyfish even or something like that that supposedly restores uh, uh, memory to older people,
Mm.
makes their minds more agile, and so on. Um, if plus the fact that what when Mark Jameson takes this, the other thing, it's not just the family youth effect, but it's also it will it's a way of treatment of this incurable neurodegenerative disease that
Yes,
he
Iverson's
has.
disease.
So it kind of puts you in the, puts one in the position that if you have a serious illness and a new therapy is developed for it, would you take it?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that most people, if they think it is safe, and there's a lot of, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. That's why we have the FDA and so forth to determine that a therapy is safe.
Mm-hmm.
That if you have a quote unquote safe drug, that particularly if it can reverse a chronic condition or a very serious debilitating division um, 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 problem, I think most people would elect to take that drug. So get back to your original question: is if there was a drug that could restore youth, would somebody take it? Would I take it? Yeah, I would consider doing that.
Yeah. I would do the same. I think, especially now since, I just turned 35 and I'm starting now to start to physically I'm starting to experience like some of the things I've done in terms of long-term injuries finally catching up with me.
Right.
And if I had a chance to go back and like heal all of that and not deal with any of it, of course I'd take that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the problem here that we face with Mark Jameson and this drug is that the story is about several things. It's about pride and it's about revenge. And I think in many ways the stories that we surround ourselves with when it comes to the search for the fountain of youth is really the question of kind of longing and wanting. And it seems that Jameson doesn't feel like he can face Karnas as he is at his older age, as degenerated as he is, because, to be fair to him, he has been facing this disease for a long time, and it has taken a huge toll on his body. When he arrives, in fact, on the Enterprise, he's wheelchair bound. Um, and this drug goes as far to miraculously reverse that in, barely a day. I think there's an element to this Fountain of Youth story that is bound up in the idea that we are never as good as we are never good as good now as we once were. And unless we return to what we once were, we can never find the ability to achieve what we think we can.
That gets into another, issue that comes out of this episode is, age and wisdom.
Yes.
And when you say that, as you grow older, you have the desire to become younger because you have the perception that you're not as capable as you were when you were younger. That's where the wisdom factor comes in, that you have had, uh, a lot more life experience. And if you are been cognizant and really reviewed what you've done and realized what led to you to be successful, to make a positive impact on other people, on your business with other people, versus those things that you did that were negative, that were mistakes, that were sinful, even that you were not that you're not proud of. You only get that sort of wisdom, I think, with experience and with age.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you can make the argument that there are certain things that you can do when you're younger that you can't do when you're older, and vice versa. There are some things you can do when you're older that you can't do when you're younger.
Absolutely.
Just thinking about this, I think a good example would be in the military.
Mm-hmm.
When you're if you're an officer, if you're a young lieutenant or captain, you're very close to the enlisted personnel. You're leading them and so forth. And your physicality is very important. You're developing leadership skills.
Mm-hmm.
You're operating in a scenario, in a small part of the battlefield. And as you grow older and you get experience as an officer, you learn how, pieces of the service fit together,
Mm-hmm.
how you can take upon, larger tasks, fight larger battles. And that's why people become colonels and captains and then generals and admirals.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have 24 years. You had it during the Civil War, but that's a whole different story right now. The reason we have, 56-year-old or 60-year-old, admirals and generals is because they have the experience under their belt of, leading, smaller units,
Mm-hmm.
and then leading larger units. And, like in the Navy, when an officer has sea duty for several years, they will alternate that out with administrative duties where they will have a land-based job.
Mm.
And then they'll go back to the sea-based duty. And I don't know how it works in the Army and Air Force and so on, but it gives the office, it builds experience and education in the officer corps and so on. So that continuing education and experience is what in a military setting could be defined as wisdom. And I think you could take those same experiences in a civilian setting and to some degree say that is how one gets wisdom. But the one caveat is, an individual has to be cognizant of what they've done that's been successful and good, and what they've done that hasn't been successful or really wasn't good.
Well, I think when it comes to Jameson, his admiralship is even muddier because he's had despite his Iverson's disease, he's had a very successful career. But what the show is going to reveal midway through, as as his neurological condition improves and his physical condition improves, he's going to have this confrontation with Karnas, where Karnas is going to reveal that the hostages are really a ploy to get Jameson to Morden 5, because it was revealed that what Jameson did on Morden 5
40 years ago.
40 years ago was, he was sent there by the Federation to broker peace as a young diplomat, and he couldn't broker peace. So he talked to the most powerful chieftain there at the time, Karnas, who had just lost his father in more tribal conflicts, and Karnas basically begged the Federation to give them weapons so they could gain dominance over the other tribal factions. The official story is that Jameson was able to talk to Karnas into pursuing peace and ultimately strive to unify the planet of Morden 4. And in the result of that was the resulting civil war. What is left out of this is that Jameson gave Karnas Federation weapons, but he also gave Federation weapons to his rivals, the other chieftains. And that exacerbated that 40-year civil war and led to untold amounts of violence
And deaths, right?
And deaths that
Yes.
have left a real psychological scar on the society of Morden 4, and especially Karnas,
Yes.
who is seeking revenge on Jameson as some way to, both publicly punish Jameson for his part in the Civil War, but also deal with Karnas's role in exacerbating it too, because Karnas is the one who, of course, seeks to acquire these weapons first.
Mhm.
There's no innocent parties here. So I think for, Jameson, there's a real muddiness to going back and dealing with this, because it's not only that he gets to go back and correct the fork he took in his youth, but it's to go back and really try to cover for something in his career that really marked his success. But when the truth comes out, what he did was violate the Prime Directive,
Mhm.
and
Yes.
that gets into a little bit of a, it. Jameson violates the Prime Directive by trying to take, I think, the quick and easy solution that he would have taken in youth, but if he had been older, he would have figured out a different solution. I think the hope that he has by going back to Morden 4 to help with this hostage scenario that Karnas has set up is that he will be able to redeem himself.
Mhm.
The problem is, just like the drug ultimately kills him at the end, spoilers for everyone, you really can't go back and, he's trying to take penance for a past action. You
Mhm.
can't go back and magically redo the past. You really have to deal with the things that were done. And I think one of the stories here in Too Short a Season, and one of the lessons is that while you can strive for the fantasy of youth and you can strive for the fantasy of going back and fixing the mistakes of the past, what you really have to do is take responsibility and deal with them for what they are here and now, and deal with them for what you've done.
Well, and
Tell
yes,
the
and
truth of them.
yeah, and that gets back to the question when we started about if you had a dream or scenario uh, that you wanted to try to act out on the holodeck, what would the meaning be?
Mm-hmm.
And based upon what you're just saying, if you had a particular situation that you wanted to do a different way, you could do it on the holodeck,
Mm-hmm.
but it really wouldn't change anything
No.
because the act would already be done in the past. So it's where, and it gets into the idea that you have to accept the past, and you have to accept the aging process too.
Well, Jameson has no. Despite all the things Jameson has with his success, the guilt of what happens on Morden 4 is driving this kind of reckless behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And it really does come into the question of like, okay, if people at home, and Ben, if you're listening to this, you're always going to make decisions along your life that, it's those forks in the road that we mentioned. That Yogi Bear says, you reach that fork in the road, take it. Once you take these forks in the road, they really are decisions that like you can't go back and just change. And you have really two choices then. You can either be bitter about the choices you made, or you can look around and see the good things you have. If you've made the right choices and taken the right forks, hopefully there will be good things. Um, Even though I would take that drug at 35 now, so I wouldn't have to deal with like the injuries from my 20s and my teens, I wouldn't want to go back and take any different forks, because if I took a different fork, I wouldn't have met Margot. And if I hadn't taken that fork, I wouldn't have married Margot, and you know Ben wouldn't be here,
Right.
and then we wouldn't be doing this podcast.
Right.
And you know it's easy to sit there and say, man, I wish I could go back and do it again or make a different decision. But when you have things that you love and appreciate, you just have to accept that the decisions that were made and live.
And this gets into the issue of revenge, and I think this came up in
Oh
a
yeah.
previous episode, that the points being made is that revenge doesn't get you anything. It's entirely negative. It's not dealing with the past and accepting it and adjusting your behavior, um, you know, so that you don't take similar action, take a similar step in the future. That's part of being wise, also.
Well, the duality of Too Short a Season is both, there is none of the crew members on the Enterprise are actually the focus of this episode.
Correct.
This is very much a story about Mark Jameson, his wife Annie, and then Karnas.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a real duality here being played between the foolishness of Jameson in his pride, and the foolishness of Karnas in his revenge.
Mm-hmm.
Because Karnas just wants to deal with this old man and like take revenge on this old man finally. And what he sees when Jameson finally beams down in the death throes of this um, reversal of his Iverson's disease by this medication that has reversed has reversed his body to the point his organs are actually collapsing on themselves.
Mm-hmm.
There's this moment where Karnas realizes, like, I've been wanting to take my vengeance on this man, but like time has taken vengeance for me,
Mm-hmm.
and I've just wasted all this time in my life.
Energy, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's Picard makes this really important speech that as much as Karnas can blame Jameson for the Civil War, Karnas is still refusing to look at his own participation. Because even though Jameson gave him the weapons, Karnas took them.
Mm-hmm.
Karnas used them. As much as Karnas wants to blame Jameson, Karnas can't go back and take a different fork in the road. And by taking revenge, Karnas thinks that he is righting some of those forks in the road.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just not. It's there, it's the illusion that somehow you can create in this one instance of release, of selfish release, you can somehow enact cause real change in the world.
Right. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't make it right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And at the same time, like, it doesn't matter if Mark Jameson shows up old and decrepit or young and vital. It still doesn't change the fact that he violated the Prime Directive and has to deal with the crimes of what he's done.
Hmm.
Like, it doesn't matter if he's young or old, he still did what he did. Um, jumping ahead a little bit. Um, I want to look at the character of Annie a little bit because on one hand, she is, you know, Jameson and Karnas are both the victims of their pride and their anger, but Annie's a true victim here in this show because all she's wanted to do is be with her husband in their later years, even if he's suffering from this terrible disease. She loves him enough because I think you and I both sense like this is a truly loving marriage. These two
It is. Yes.
really do love each other.
Right.
I think the saddest thing about Annie's character is that she has all of her agency taken from her.
Hmm.
And it really is kind of like this real world. I was thinking about this before we got together to record this episode. Do you know what I remember about the 90s growing up in St. Louis?
Yeah.
And I think about it a lot when it comes to like my marriage and then your marriage to mom. In some ways, it's kind of miraculous that marriages survive at all in some ways because, without giving away too much information, um, your marriage to my mother is your second marriage.
Hmm.
Um, divorce is a pretty regular thing now here in America.
Hmm.
I, it's so sad because Annie is probably so familiar to a lot of people who have had their significant other make a decision on them without their input, and then you suddenly have to deal with the ramifications of it. And when those ramifications are permanent, it just has to be so debilitating. But despite that, like, despite Annie losing all of her agency, she's the best character of the entire show because she, you know, Karnas and Jacobson are not Jacobson, Jameson. God damn it. Jameson and Karnas are unable to find closure. The beauty of Annie is that Annie is able to create her own closure at the very end by being able to say goodbye to Mark as he's dying.
Yes.
I was just wondering if you had any reflections on Annie as a character and just her storyline in this episode, and if there's any lessons to be taken away from her in contrast to Karnas or her husband, the departed Mark Jameson.
Yeah, I made the comment. I think that I agree with you that they had a very loving marriage. It was interesting that there was no mention of any children at any point. That didn't come into it. It just focused on, Mark and Annie's relationship. But I
You know
think
what?
you just
Children in the future don't seem to be something that is, I guess, culturally like promoted as being a requirement. Even though
it's
there's a lot of people with children, there also seems to be a lot of people who are just married without them.
Star Trek in the future kind of portrays children becoming much more independent of their parents.
Very true.
Um, but that issue aside, I think that she, as you said, when Mark decided to take the drug and he did not let her know that he had it, and then she's wondering what is going on. and then he, he starts to peel the onion for her and tells her what he has done, and to some extent why he did it, and so on, which is obvious. One of the reasons that he wants it as a treatment for the Iverson's disease. She is hurt because he was not honest with her, but her love for him and support for him doesn't diminish. So I think that just as a spouse character in this story, she's very strong. Yes.
I think it's also a question of like, I think one sign of maturity is being able to be satisfied with where you are in life. And maybe that's a definition of being present. I think one of the things that like separates Annie and maybe makes it so much more painful when she has to deal with Mark's actions is that she is very committed to being present at the time that they're together. Where it seems like he is so mired in the past when this thing with Karnas comes up, he's willing to throw his life away to deal with it.
And he really does, yes.
And I think the lesson there in that maturity is that, you should rather be like Annie and enjoy what you have now with whom you have it, instead of doing what, Jameson and Karnas have done, which is mire in the past. Maybe the title Too Short a Season is, you don't really have that long in life, or you don't have as much time as you think you do, even though, it's important to note that Jameson is probably like Dr. McCoy, probably in his 137s, his 130s, his 140s.
Perhaps, yeah.
There's just a real value in being able to be satisfied with where you are and what you have, even if it isn't perfect. And Annie kind of exemplifies that. Is there anything that you wanted to touch on before we kind of jump to the next big question?
Go ahead on to the next big question.
So before we get to the next big question, just to end things with Too Short a Season, did you like this episode?
Yeah, I thought it was a good episode. There wasn't a lot of science fiction to it, other than the Fountain of Youth drug, which is an old theme, an old idea going back to Paul Leon and before, but it was just a good human drama that took place out in the galaxy, really.
One thing that I'm noticing as we go through these episodes, a common critique that we keep hearing is that the first season of Star Trek The Next Generation is not very good. But the more we see these episodes, the more I really wonder where that comes from, because a lot of these stories are very, very well put together.
They are. They really are. Yeah.
So on that note, thank you for everyone for taking the time to listen to us talk about Too Short a Season. The next episode we will be looking at is Star Trek The Next Generation Season 1, Episode 17, When the Bow Breaks.
Yes, right.
But to close off, you actually had a question about, we were talking about Jameson violating the Prime Directive by giving weapons to the natives more than 4. And it gets into the question of, like, we've been talking previously about America and her original sin. And you had a question in the notes you sent me. Was the original sin of America actually the European colonization, or was it African slavery?
Yes. And
am I representing that question well?
Yeah, and the reason I put that question is I stumbled on Amazon Prime a British series, brief, just 3 episode series, War of the Worlds.
Oh yeah.
which was a version of it was based on H.G. Wells, and it took place in 1905 and 1906, and focused on the Martians coming to London.
Mhm.
And one of the protagonists in the story, is thinking about what's going on, and because the Martians seem to be in this story, War of the Worlds story, seem to be terraforming or Marsiforming the Earth back into Mars. And George, one of the protagonists, says, "Look, are the Martians doing the same thing that we did when we colonized people in Africa or India?" He didn't mention the Americas at all, but of course, you make the jump is, when you go, when a colonizer, which in many cases, in most cases here, has been a more advanced uh, group, technologically and so forth, find a new land, as happened in the 15th century and into the 19th century and so forth, and they colonize that land, and with the idea that they're going to bring modern technology and so forth, that they basically do um, sort of terraform that less developed society. They try to give it the benefits of their more advanced society, but in the process, that less developed culture, to use that term, is either destroyed or suffers.
So,
So, and I think that part of the discussions we've had in the past is that in terms of America, first the United States go, in terms of when the country was founded and our governing principles and philosophy, that definitely the original sin is slavery, because it could have been dealt with at the time of the revolution.
Oh yeah.
And it wasn't. And it's still, the sequelae up to that still aren't complete. We're working through that, as we speak today and so on. But, the whole idea of colonization being sinful, I've thought about that a little bit more, in that, since we are animals and people, they're animals, different species compete for an ecological niche, that if you have a group of individuals that develop, and they are become more advanced technologically in terms of language skills and in agriculture and that sort of thing, over another group, there's going to be a natural competition to fill that niche, to the extent that the less advanced group might be pushed out. And I think we've talked about this before, is that that's what happened to modern Homo sapiens, or whatever the specific the specific epithet was before we were sapiens, that we outcompeted the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. Even though it's evident now from our understanding of DNA and genetics that humans, the ancestors of Homo sapiens, were able to breed with these other human races, even though they don't persist anymore. We do have, to varying degrees, Denisovan and Neanderthal genes as part of our genetic makeup now.
Yes. Well, the difficult story, I think, of humanity, and when it comes to colonization, I think that there are. I think getting to the central question here about the original sin of America. I think slavery is obviously the original. African slavery is obviously the original sin here in America just because of the level of human degradation we employed to enforce it.
Hmm.
Now we had slavery for thousands of years beforehand. That was just as horrible and just as degrading to the human spirit. But what we enacted here in America, and especially in the South, where you and I are from, was particularly egregious to the point that later groups that espoused far right ideology and hatred used many of the things that we did in the South uh, to enact their own suffering and evils upon the people they wish to oppress. So, African slavery is clearly the um, original sin of America. I think looking at colonization as a sin is appropriate in many senses, but it's also difficult because of many of the things you highlighted, especially when it comes to the issue of technology. Because one thing that we have to, I think, recognize when it comes to colonization is that colonization is not predicated necessarily on one group being morally or ethically better than another group. Like you said, it really does come down to certain ecological and evolutionary strengths, including like the ability and access to certain tools that some groups have over the others. Like the reason why Cortez was able to just wipe out the Aztecs is because he had, they may have had um, a troop count that was probably, 10 to every one of his soldiers. But the fact that he had
Horses and horses. Yeah.
he had horses and firearms
Right.
set him so far ahead of them that
Right.
it really was an equalizer. Um, I think the evil of colonization or colonialism, is that it it's built on this kind of degrading idea that the people that are coming in have a subset of ideas and philosophies that are automatically superior to anything native to whatever they're taking over.
Hmm.
So the destruction of culture is real. And that is probably the most damaging aspect of colonialism. At the same time, it's hard in the modern day when people like for example, I'm politically on the left. One thing that is very difficult when dealing with my fellow leftists is they want to talk about the evils of colonialism and act like somehow that it's reversible. But a lot of the things that come out of colonialism are the same things that come out of a lot of conflicts. Like, for example, you wouldn't have access to a lot of the foods, medicines, and cultural things that you use today unless someone went to different lands and colonized them and took aspects of those native cultures, appropriated them, and recast them into our modern day zeitgeist in terms of how we use them now. So, like, as much as we like to say colonialism is bad, there's so many things that we've benefited from that came directly out of colonialism. So you have to ask the question, like, okay, you dislike colonialism, but do you dislike colonialism enough to do away with the products of them,
Well, I mean, here's an example. I think that
both
there's a,
good and bad?
yeah. I
That's a
mean,
very difficult
I mean, if
conversation.
you look at European colonialism in Africa, particularly in Africa, and to some extent in Asia as well, but particularly Africa, the Europeans went into Africa, and you said some negative thing about the Belgians and got punished temporarily by Facebook last week.
Oh yeah, I said
Um,
so. Just to give people some background, um, one so the Belgians under Leopold II, I believe, went into the Congo, which is in Central Africa, and basically set up rubber plantations. And the way they treated their slave labor is some of the most brutal things that you ever done. And I said in the course of reflecting on this, fuck them Belgians, and
Well, and see
face
what
beside me
happened
for hate
is,
speech.
and what the Europeans did, and the British did it, the French did it, the Belgians are a really good example in the Congo. The Dutch did it in Indonesia, so on.
The French did it in Thailand and Cambodia.
The British and the French and the Germans, and to some extent the Americans did it in China in the early 18 hundreds. Not so much colonialism there, but I think the bad part of colonialism is when you go into an area and you're technologically superior, so you can control the land and the people, and then you just take the resources out of that land, whether it's minerals or rubber or a certain type of agricultural product, and you do nothing to develop that land. That you're just basically, you're adding to the wealth of the home country, and do nothing to develop and make things better for the people that you take responsibility for when you establish the colony and then you govern them. That's bad. That's evil. And let me finish. And you look at what's happened in America. You have the problem, the sin of African slavery to build the agricultural base in the South.
The entire economic base of the South.
And which was very much the economic base of the whole country at that time. And then you look at the Native Americans, what we did to them is basically just took their land.
Oh, yeah.
And disabused them of their land. Now, the one interesting thing I just thought of is that if we colonize the moon, if we colonize Mars, as far as we know, there's no sentient life on there that we're going to affect. We're going to go and create a new environment in which humans can live. We're going to, mine those moons and planets for mineral resources and so on. And, story I think we touched on a previous podcast is the sequel to 2001, 2010, which focuses on, Jupiter turning into another star. And there is sentient life on Europa. And at the end of the story, mankind is given the moons of Jupiter or this new star as other worlds that they can inhabit. And, if they do that, they're not going to have any, if they colonize those new worlds, which were the moons of Jupiter, they're not going to have an adverse effect on anyone. But the beings on Europa are saying, don't come here.
Yeah.
Which is the lesson that we have our own culture, we have our own civilization, society. Who knows what kind of beings they are? Don't come here because we're going to collide. We don't want to be colonized by you. Well, and it sets up a whole different relationship in terms of, actually the one thing that's key here is that the beings on Europa, because of what they're able to do, are more technologically more advanced than the humans are.
So, I think one thing that colonization is primarily built off of, and so is all systems of hatred and oppression, is the othering of another group or another group of individuals.
Right.
And I think, one thing that you did bring up, and bringing it back to Star Trek for a second, the Prime Directive is set up in a way that is supposed to somehow mitigate, I guess, the improper contact between pre-warp civilizations that aren't ready to travel into space, and essentially set up commerce. Because it looks like what the Federation philosophy is, it's like, well, we're not going to colonize you, but we'll get you involved in our trade and our marketplaces. And in that way, we'll spread our values to you. That way, it's kind of the old capitalist idea that, like, if we just spread capitalism to them, we open up their marketplaces, they're going to pick up our values too.
What we sort of hoped would have happened with China and giving them the internet.
Oh, it's what we hoped would happen with Iraq and Afghanistan when we
Oh,
went over there
yes.
and trying to,
Yes. Right.
plant the trees of democracy, according to
Yes.
George W. Bush.
Right.
Um, I think the problem is you're dealing with kind of a conundrum because you either have this philosophy built on othering something, in that case colonialism or conquering is kind of a requirement because you can't trust the person across from you. But the other one is taking the very big risk of you know going down to I when Columbus met those those native Caribbeans, I don't think that, well, he did intend to oppress them and take their resources, but I don't think that he intended to automatically give them the cold or diseases.
No, they didn't understand that at
No,
all.
no one understood that.
No, not at
So,
all.
but like there's also this kind of like, when he first meets the people that he will call the Indians, he kind of marvels at them, and it's a very brave thing to walk up to a complete group of strangers and suddenly just try to interact peacefully. And you have to have this idea that the person across from you, even though they might have a different skin color from you or dress different from you or speak in a language that you don't understand, they are essentially you because they are a human being too. And just having that central belief, and what I'm talking about here is basic humanism, just having the central belief that you are me and I am you, in terms of us just being a human being, and that is a basis for us to start having a conversation based on shared principles and dignity versus one of conflict where I other you and you other me back. Um, that is a very difficult thing to do where colonization is just easy. And I think that is really where, when we talk about good and evil, good is difficult. Like doing real good in this world, and this working in 501c3s and working in so many different nonprofits throughout your career, doing real good is very difficult. Evil, however, is the simplest choice in the world.
Hmm.
And it really is. Evil's a
Hmm.
lazy, pleasurable, simple choice. And Ben, you're listening to this, and we'll kind of end it here because you have a bedtime too. Um, the hardest thing you will ever have to choose to do is always the right thing.
Hmm.
And that is a lesson that we're not taught growing up. It's something that you know my daddy, um Pop, who's hosting this podcast with me, he wasn't automatically taught it. I wasn't automatically taught it growing up. You're not going to automatically be taught it because having those instances of having to do real good are, we're not cognizant of them when they come up. Some of it's natural, but
Well, the only thing that your mother-in-law tried to pass on to you and your sisters is, you know, while you're here, do everything you can to make the world a better place
yes.
for people now and for people in the future, and specifically for your children and your grandchildren. If you can do that, that can extend to humanity in general. Now, obviously, in terms of day-to-day living, that's easier said than done.
Hmm.
Easier said than done.
Well,
The
that's the thing.
the one thought I just had about Columbus and landing on San Salvador and meeting the Amur Indians, the Amur Caribbean Indians, at the very end of the Enterprise series with Jonathan Archer,
All right.
Riker and Troy had the ability to go back on the holodeck and kind of observe what happened when the Federation was founded, what happened to Archer. but they had good historical records to base it upon. It
Mhm.
would be interesting if you could, create a scenario on the holodeck where you could go back and be when Columbus landed on October 12th, 1492.
Ooh,
However, we couldn't do it because we don't have specific enough data. The only way you could really study it is if you could time travel.
very true. Though, well, I don't know. So at the beginning of Star Trek Generations, they're on the USS Enterprise, the schooner.
Oh, yes.
So you might not be able to recreate. I agree with you. You probably wouldn't have enough historical data to recreate the landing and the meeting with the Amur Indians,
Hmm.
but you could probably like recreate the journey from Spain
Oh, sure.
to.
You could do that.
You could
Yeah.
do that, but I think you're
Yeah.
absolutely right in terms of actually
Right.
creating the meeting with the Indians, and
Right.
yeah, that would probably be too difficult.
Hmm.
And on that, we will close it up for the night. Dad, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. This was a really great conversation.
Thank you, Jay. It was good. Yes.
We'll see you all next time. Thank you for joining us for Where No Bubs Has Gone Before.